The black Escalade rolled to a stop at the corner of Fulton and 9th. Reese Calder wasn't supposed to be here. His driver had taken a wrong turn off the expressway, cutting through a neighborhood that smelled like wet concrete and burnt grease. Reese was about to say something about the delay when he saw them. 4 children on a frozen sidewalk. A man in a gray county jacket was dragging the oldest girl toward a white van. She wasn't screaming. Her jaw was locked shut, teeth clenched so hard the muscles in her neck stood out like cables. Her free hand reached back toward the 3 children behind her, fingers grabbing at cold air. The oldest boy shoved the man hard. The man stumbled, caught himself, and backhanded the boy across the mouth. The sound carried through the closed window. A flat, wet crack. The boy hit the ground, blood on his lip. He got up immediately. Didn't touch his face. Just stood between the man and his siblings again with his fists clenched. 14 years old, with the posture of someone who'd decided a long time ago he'd keep standing until his legs gave out. Behind him, a boy of 8 clutched a stuffed rabbit, shoulders pulled up like he was trying to disappear. And the smallest, a girl no older than 3, gripped her brother's jacket with both fists. Her mouth was open, but nothing came out, like somebody had reached inside her throat and stolen her voice. Reese's hand was on the door handle before he knew he'd moved. "Boss," Sully said, "we're 14 minutes late." Reese was already on the sidewalk. The man looked up. Keith Drummond, Child Protective Services. The kind of man who smiled when he shouldn't. He smiled now. "Can I help you?" Let go of her arm. Something in Reese's voice changed the air. Drummond looked at him. Really looked. At the coat that cost more than his monthly salary. At the Escalade. At the man the size of a refrigerator standing beside it. At Reese's eyes, gray and empty of anything resembling patience. His hand loosened. The girl pulled free. Drummond straightened his jacket. "You just interfered with a state custody action. I could have you arrested. You could try." Silence. "What do you want?" Drummond asked. "How much?" "All 4 of them." Drummond named a number. Obscene. Enough to buy a car. Enough to know he'd done this before. He knew exactly what children were worth when nobody important was looking. Reese didn't blink. Sully. The envelope. Drummond counted the bills with practiced fingers, the way a man counts who's counted dirty money before. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket. "Kids are all yours." He said it like someone says the trash is at the curb, then walked away without looking back. The oldest boy watched him go, then looked at Reese with eyes that held no gratitude, only the cold math of a child calculating which adult would hurt him next. "We ain't going with nobody," he said. "Not him, not you." Reese crouched down, eye level with the smallest girl. Up close, her face was blank. Her eyes looked past him, past everything, like she'd gone somewhere deep inside herself where no one could reach. He spoke softer than Sully had ever heard him speak, softer than his voice had any right to be, coming from a man who controlled half the underground operations on the eastern seaboard. "All of you. Come with me. Somewhere warm, somewhere that man can never touch you again." "And then what?" the boy demanded. "Then we figure it out." Nobody moved. Then the smallest girl released her brother's jacket, took 2 steps forward on bare feet, reached out with tiny fingers, and wrapped them around Reese's thumb. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just held on. Something cracked open in Reese's chest. Something he'd sealed shut 24 years ago when they took his sister Sadie, and he couldn't stop them. He was 13. She was 5. He never found her. But he found these 4, on a frozen sidewalk, on a wrong turn. On a day he wasn't supposed to be here, he stood. Her hand stayed locked around his thumb. The oldest boy watched, then took his sister's hand. She took the 8-year-old's. The 8-year-old reached for the little girl. 4 children. One line. Holding on. They walked to the Escalade. The door opened. Warm air hit their faces. Not one of them let go. Friends, if this story is pulling at your heart, subscribe and stay with us until the end. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story reaches. Now, let's continue. The private elevator carried them up to the 47th floor. The ride lasted 50 seconds, but felt like an entire lifetime. Bo whispered the floor numbers under his breath, his voice so faint it was almost non-existent. 7, 8, 9. It was the only sound besides the steady mechanical hum. Sully stood beside Reese, jaw clenched tight, keeping every thought and question sealed behind closed teeth. He had followed Reese for 12 years, had seen his boss do things no one would have predicted. But bringing 4 filthy children from a frozen sidewalk into the penthouse went beyond anything he could have imagined. Jace stood close to the elevator door, his back pressed against the cold metal wall, shielding his 3 younger siblings behind him. His eyes were locked on the steel doors as if bracing for something worse to rush in the moment they opened. Piper held Willa in her arms, both of them trembling. Whether from cold or fear, no one could tell, likely both. The doors slid open, and the children froze. In front of them stretched a space of more than 400 square meters, ceilings soaring high above, glass windows running from floor to ceiling, revealing the entire city glittering below. They had never seen a place like this, had never imagined places like this existed outside of movies. The penthouse was designed in a minimalist style, everything expensive enough that it didn't need to show off, yet cold in the way of a man who had lived alone for too long. No family photographs on the walls, no keepsakes on the shelves, only the lifeless perfection of furniture chosen by a designer rather than by someone who truly lived there. Jace took it in immediately, survival instinct sharpened through years in shelters and rundown apartments, where the exits were, whether anything could be used as a weapon. How far it was from here back to the elevator. Piper's gaze drifted toward the open kitchen. A real kitchen with a 6-burner gas stove and a double-door stainless steel refrigerator, not the old electric hot plate in the damp rooming house where they'd once crowded together. Bo walked toward the glass, the city stretching beneath him like a blanket of light, and for the first time in months, the 8-year-old felt as if he were standing on clouds. Agnes appeared from the hallway in the back, 68 years old. Silver hair neatly twisted into a bun at the nape of her neck. A spotless white apron tied at her waist, eyes sharp as a hawk sweeping across the room. She looked at the 4 filthy, freezing, frightened children huddled in the middle of the living room. Then she looked at Reese with an expression that clearly said, "We will talk later." But she didn't ask a single question, not one word of doubt or judgment. She simply said, "Bathroom first, then food. Follow me." 40 minutes later, the children sat around the dining table in temporary clothes. Old t-shirts of Reese's folded up several times and still hanging loose on their small frames. In front of each of them was a bowl of hot chicken soup and freshly baked bread. Jace ate slowly, his eyes never leaving the others in the room, tasting each spoonful before giving a small nod to signal to his siblings that it was safe. Bo ate as if afraid someone would snatch the bowl away at any second. Piper ate with one hand while the other kept Willa on her lap. And Willa didn't eat. The 3-year-old simply sat there, eyes fixed on nothing, as if her soul had drifted somewhere far beyond reach. Jace set his spoon down and looked straight at Reese at the head of the table. "What do you want from us?" Reese answered without hesitation. "Nothing." Jace sniffed softly, his voice thick with disbelief. "Everyone wants something." Reese tilted his head, studying the 14-year-old with eyes far older than his years. "What did the last person want?" Silence. Jace didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. Reese gave a small nod as if that confirmed something he had already known. "I want you to eat, to sleep, to be warm. That's all. Tonight, that's enough." After dinner, Reese led them down the hallway. There were 4 empty bedrooms. "Each of you can have your own room." Jace shook his head immediately, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "We sleep together. Always." Reese didn't argue, didn't insist. He simply nodded and opened the door to the largest bedroom, where a king-size bed could hold all 4 of them. The children climbed onto the mattress, arranging themselves automatically as if they'd done this 100 times before. Piper lay in the middle, Willa curled in her arms like a small kitten. Bo pressed close beside them, stuffed rabbit clutched tight against his chest, and Jace lay on the outside, his back toward his siblings, his face toward the door, ready, guarding. As on every night before, Reese stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the 4 small shapes on the oversized bed. Then he turned off the light, left the door slightly open so a thin line of hallway light could slip inside, and walked away. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that tonight, for the first time in 24 years, the penthouse was no longer completely empty. At 5:30 in the morning, Reese woke as he always did. For 20 years, he hadn't slept more than 6 hours a night. His body trained to the rhythm of a man who always had to stay alert. He put on a shirt without bothering to button it and stepped into the living room in the pale gray light of dawn. Then he stopped. Jace was already there. In the armchair facing the hallway that led to the bedrooms, The 14-year-old sat curled in on himself, eyes wide open, frighteningly awake. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but there was no trace of exhaustion in that stare. He hadn't slept all night. He was standing guard, the way he had on so many nights before, in so many other places, protecting his siblings from dangers no 14-year-old should ever have to know. Reese said nothing. He didn't ask why the boy was awake. He didn't tell him to go to bed. He simply walked to the chair opposite, sat down, and picked up the newspaper from the coffee table. He opened it and began to read. Silence. Jace watched him, waiting for a question, a reprimand, an order. None came. Only the soft rustle of paper as Reese turned the pages. The silence stretched on. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. The light beyond the glass shifted slowly from gray to pale gold. Nearly an hour later, Jace was the one who broke it. "Aren't you going to ask why I'm awake?" Reese didn't look up from the paper. "No." Jace frowned. "Why not?" Only then did Reese fold the newspaper, rest it on his lap, and look straight at him. "Because I know why. I used to do the same thing." Jace fell quiet. For the first time since meeting this man on the frozen sidewalk, he truly looked at him. Not the way he looked at a threat, not the way he calculated how this adult might hurt him, but the way one human being looks at another who might understand. In the kitchen, Agnes had been awake for some time. The soft clink of pans touching, the scent of melting butter and brewing coffee, began to drift through the penthouse. Piper appeared at the kitchen doorway, her hair still tangled from sleep, her eyes heavy, yet she was fully dressed, shirt buttoned to the collar as if preparing for work. She walked straight to the sink without a greeting. "I can help." Agnes turned and studied her, sharp eyes sweeping from head to toe, taking in the 17-year-old, with work-hardened hands and shoulders bowed beneath burdens far too heavy for her age. "No," Piper didn't step back. "I always help. I can wash dishes. I can chop vegetables. I can do whatever you need." Agnes set down the wooden spoon and stepped in front of her. She placed a hand on Piper's shoulder, gentle but firm. "You're a child, not a servant. Sit down. Eat." Piper stood there, her hands hanging at her sides, unsure what to do with them. For 2 years, since their mother began to fail, she hadn't been allowed to sit still. There was always work to do, always a sibling to tend, always money to find. And now, for the first time in 2 years, no one needed her to do anything at all. The feeling was so unfamiliar it was almost painful. Bo appeared quietly like a shadow, barefoot on the warm wooden floor. The 8-year-old said nothing, simply climbed onto a high stool in the corner of the kitchen and sat there clutching his worn stuffed rabbit. Agnes watched him for a moment, then placed a pencil and a few paper napkins in front of him. Bo took the pencil and began to draw. Childish, uneven lines, yet carrying something deeper. 4 small figures holding hands in a single line, and one larger figure standing a short distance away, separate, as if not part of the group, yet not entirely absent either. Agnes saw the drawing when he finished. She didn't speak, didn't comment. She simply folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Breakfast was served. Golden pancakes, fried eggs, crisp bacon, and a pitcher of fresh orange juice. Jace entered the kitchen last, taking the chair positioned so he could see both the door and the windows. Even while eating, he never stopped watching. Willa sat in Piper's lap as always, her wide eyes fixed on empty space, not eating, not speaking, offering no response to the world around her. But something was different today. Her eyes moved, tracking the people in the room, from Agnes pouring milk, to Bo chewing his pancake, to Jace cutting his meat. She was still inside her cocoon, but perhaps she was beginning to look out. No one spoke much during the meal, only the quiet clink of utensils against plates and Agnes asking who wanted more. But for the first time, the children ate without rushing, without slipping food into pockets for later, without fearing someone would snatch the plate away before they were finished. For the first time in a very long while, they were allowed to eat like ordinary children. The first week passed like a string of small moments, the first cracks in the wall the children had built around themselves. On the 3rd night, at 2 a.m, Jace couldn't sleep again. He lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of his siblings. Piper shifted now and then. Bo clutched his stuffed rabbit tight. Willa curled into herself like a small question mark. He slipped out of bed carefully, bare feet touching the cool wooden floor, and walked into the living room. He stopped at the penthouse front door, He stood there for a while, staring at the dark wood and the polished brass handle. Then he placed his hand on it, turned it gently. The door opened. It wasn't locked. No alarm sounded. No one came running to ask what he was doing. Jace stood there, looking out at the hallway, the elevator at the far end with its red button glowing in the dark. He could leave, right now, wake his siblings and take them with him. Go back to the streets, back to what he understood, what he could control. He stood there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Cold air drifted in from the hallway, making him shiver. Then he closed the door, went back to bed, climbed in beside his siblings and pulled the blanket to his chest. He didn't leave. He didn't know why. Bo found his comfort in a place no one would have expected. On the second day, wandering through the penthouse, he discovered the large balcony overlooking the city, and on the railing, a flock of city pigeons perched, cooing in the early sun. The 8-year-old stopped at the glass door, eyes wide, watching the gray birds with their iridescent green and violet necks. He didn't go outside, didn't try to open the door. He just stood there, one hand pressed against the glass, watching them lift off and settle again, watching them tilt their heads and hop along the railing. Agnes noticed. She said nothing, but that afternoon a small chair appeared by the glass door, just the right size for an 8-year-old boy. Bo sat there for hours each day, drawing on the sheets of paper Agnes gave him, glancing up at the pigeons from time to time before bending back to his work. He still didn't speak to anyone except Piper, and only in whispers, only when absolutely necessary. But his eyes were less wild, less afraid. Willa had her own ritual. Every night, after Piper put her to bed, after her siblings had fallen asleep, the 3-year-old would quietly slip down, walk on her tiny feet into the hallway. She would go to Reese's door, which was always left slightly open, a strip of warm yellow light spilling out. She stood there, looking in through the narrow opening. Reese sat in a chair reading or working on his laptop, the desk lamp casting light across his face. She didn't go in, didn't make a sound. She simply stood there for 2 or 3 minutes, watching, as if confirming something. Then she returned to the bedroom, climbed back into bed, curled into Piper's arms, and slept. Reese knew. He always knew when she came. He could see her small shadow on the floor through the crack in the door, could hear the faint rhythm of her breathing. He never looked up, never called her inside. He just kept reading, kept working, letting her do what she needed to do, and he never closed his door completely. On the 5th day, Piper was helping Agnes wash dishes after lunch. Agnes had allowed her to do small tasks, understanding that this 17-year-old needed to do something, needed to feel useful. Piper dried a plate, looked out the window, then asked, her voice almost casual though her eyes were not, "Who is he? Who is he really?" Agnes didn't stop washing the pot. "He's the man who hired me." 10 years ago, Piper set the plate down and turned to her. "That's not what I asked." Agnes paused, dried her hands on a towel, and looked at the girl with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "He's not a good man. But he's not a bad man either. He's complicated." Piper frowned. "What does that mean?" Agnes placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice softer now but still steady as steel. "It means he does things I don't ask about, but he always keeps his word. Always. If he says you're safe here, then you're safe." Piper studied her for a long moment, weighing each word, then nodded and turned back to the sink. She didn't ask anything more. Maybe she didn't need more answers, or maybe she wasn't ready to hear them. On the 7th morning, breakfast unfolded as usual. Agnes made pancakes, eggs, bacon. Bo sat in the small chair by the window, eyes turned toward the pigeons but ears tuned to every sound in the room. Willa sat in Piper's lap, still not eating but allowing Piper to feed her a few sips of milk. Reese sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. Jace entered the kitchen last, as he did every day, and took the seat that gave him a clear view of both the door and the windows. He reached toward the salt shaker in the middle of the table, then paused. He looked at Reese, and instead of saying "Sir" or "Mr." or saying nothing at all like on the previous days, he said, "Pass the salt, Reese," the name, the first time he had used it. Reese handed the salt across without changing his expression, without lifting his eyes from the newspaper, without any sign that he noticed the shift. But Sully, standing in the corner with a cup of coffee in his hand, noticed. He looked at Jace, then at Reese, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Something had changed. Just a little. almost invisible, but it had changed. On the 10th night, at 2 a.m, Jace couldn't sleep again. He had tried, lying there for hours with his eyes closed, but his mind wouldn't slow down. Too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his siblings, and walked into the living room. He stopped at the threshold. Reese was already there, sitting in the armchair by the large window, looking out at the city below. No lights were on, only the glow of millions of city lights filtering through the glass, washing the room in a faint silver-blue haze. He sat completely still, like a statue, a glass of liquor in his hand barely touched. Jace almost turned back. This wasn't his business, not his problem. But his feet wouldn't move. "Do you sit like this every night?" Reese didn't turn around, didn't show any surprise at the sound of his voice, as if he had known Jace was there all along. Most nights. Jace stood there for a moment, weighing something inside himself. Then he walked over and sat down in the chair opposite. Not the strategic position he usually chose, not the seat that allowed him to watch the door, just the closest chair. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of silence shared by two people, waiting for something they both knew would come. "Who are you? Who are you really? And don't give me that complicated answer Agnes likes to use." Reese didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the window, on the city breathing softly in the night. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It sounded distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Jace. "I had a little sister once. Sadie. She was 5. I was 13. Jace didn't say anything. He just listened. The foster system. Probably like you kids. Different houses, different cities. One day they came. Said they had found her a family. A real family. Adoption. A pause, as long as a single breath. I asked to go with her. They said no. I was too old. Nobody wants a 13-year-old. Reese lifted the glass to his lips, took a small sip, then lowered it again. I watched them put her in the car. She was crying, calling my name. I tried to run after them. They held me back. His voice didn't shake. It didn't break. It was flat, like the surface of a winter lake. And that stillness was what made it frightening. That was 24 years ago. Jace swallowed. Did you ever find her? Reese shook his head slowly. No. I never stopped looking. Everything I built was partly so I could keep looking. 24 years. Nothing. Jace studied the man in front of him, truly studied him for the first time. Not as a threat, not as an exit to calculate, but as someone carrying a wound that looked painfully familiar. So you stopped that day, on that street, because of us. Reese finally turned, gray eyes meeting the brown eyes of a 14-year-old boy. I couldn't save her. But I saw the 4 of you, and I thought maybe I could try. Silence lingered. The city below kept flickering, indifferent to the sorrow being spoken 47 floors above. Jace lowered his head, looking at his hands, fingers laced together. Our mom died 8 months ago. Cancer. It took 2 years to kill her. Reese said nothing. He just listened. Willa stopped talking the day she died. Hasn't said a single word since. Not one. Jace's voice cracked at the end, but he forced it steady again. The doctors said it's trauma, said she might never speak again. Reese didn't respond. There was nothing to say. No words that could ease that kind of pain. No answers for wounds cut too deep to heal clean. They sat there in silence, 2 figures before the enormous window. The city spread beneath them like a blanket of light. Jace didn't get up. He didn't go back to bed. He stayed there in the dark beside Reese, the 2 of them looking out at the city without speaking again. For the first time since stepping into the penthouse, Jace wasn't sitting across from Reese as if facing an enemy. He was sitting next to him, like 2 people looking in the same direction. Like 2 people carrying wounds no one else could fully understand. 2 weeks passed. Life in the penthouse began to find its own rhythm. The children were slowly growing used to waking without fear, eating without rushing, sleeping without having to stand guard every moment. But beyond the glass walls, trouble was moving closer. Sully stepped into Reese's office on the 30th floor, his expression more serious than usual. Reese looked up from the stack of papers in front of him and immediately sensed something was wrong. Sully never interrupted unless it truly mattered. "Boss, we've got a problem." Reese set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. "Go on. Drummond, the CPS guy. He's digging into you." Reese lifted an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. He doesn't know who you are, just sees a rich man buying kids off the street. He wants more, double the original amount, every week, or he'll report suspicious financial activity to the authorities. Reese was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Then he spoke, his tone as calm as if discussing the weather. Let him come. Sully blinked. Boss, set up a meeting. Here, in my office. Sully hesitated, glancing toward the ceiling as if he could see through 17 floors to the penthouse above. What about the kids? Upstairs with Agnes. Drummond doesn't go near the penthouse. Ever. Sully nodded and left to arrange it. 3 days later, Keith Drummond walked into the office on the 30th floor, wearing the confident smile of a man who believed he held leverage over a wealthy target. He wore the same gray county jacket, but this time with a cheap tie and shoes polished carelessly. Mr. Calder, nice place. Business must be treating you well. Reese sat behind his dark walnut desk. He didn't stand, didn't offer his hand, didn't invite him to sit. He simply watched Drummond with gray eyes as cold as steel, devoid of emotion. Drummond pulled out a chair himself and sat down, either not noticing or not caring about the lack of courtesy. He clasped his hands together, grin wide. Let's get straight to it. That little transaction we had before, the price has gone up. Reese said nothing. Double what you paid. Weekly. Or I start making phone calls. Child trafficking is a serious crime, Mr. Calder, even for rich men. Reese remained silent, letting him talk. Drummond mistook the silence for fear and leaned forward, growing bolder. You think you can buy kids off the street and nobody notices. I notice. I've got files. I've got evidence. I've got contacts in the press. A story like this. Mysterious billionaire buys 4 kids from the system. How do you think that ends? He leaned back again, satisfied with himself. So we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice. Reese finally moved. He opened a drawer in his desk, removed a thick folder, and placed it on the surface. Keith Andrew Drummond, CPS Case Coordinator, 7 years. Drummond frowned, his smile faltering. 9 children in 5 years. All transferred to approved facilities. All vanished from the system within months. Drummond went still. Deposits into an account in the Cayman Islands. $47,000 last year alone. Shall I continue? Drummond's face drained of color in seconds. Reese pushed the folder toward him. You sell children, Mr. Drummond. The only question is to whom. Drummond looked around the room for the first time with real awareness. He noticed the perfect silence of the soundproofed office. Noticed Sully standing by the door like an immovable wall. Noticed the way Reese sat there in complete control, completely calm, like a predator toying with prey. Who are you? His voice trembled. Reese rose slowly, walked around the desk, and stopped directly in front of him. Drummond had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze, and for the first time he understood how badly he had miscalculated. Reese bent slightly, speaking softly, almost in a whisper, but each word sharp as a blade. I'm the man you tried to extort. That was a mistake. Drummond swallowed, his throat bobbing. Reese straightened and looked down at him as if studying an insect. You'll resign tomorrow. You'll leave this city. You'll never touch another child again. Drummond nodded frantically, all confidence gone. Reese tilted his head, his voice still light as air. If I hear your name one more time, Mr. Drummond, you won't hear anything ever again. Drummond shot to his feet, nearly stumbling over the chair, and rushed out of the office without looking back. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing faster, then fading. Sully stepped up beside Reese, watching the direction Drummond had fled. Want me to follow him? Reese shook his head and walked to the window, looking out over the city below. No, let him run. Men like him always lead to bigger fish. Sully nodded. They both knew Drummond wasn't acting alone. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. And now the pawn was frightened. He would run straight back to whoever controlled him. Reese would wait. He was very good at waiting. 3 weeks had passed since the day they stepped into this penthouse. Everything was settling into a kind of stability the children had never known. Jace stood guard less often, sometimes even sleeping through the night without waking to check the doors. Beau had begun to say a few words to Agnes, simple ones like more please when he wanted another pancake or thank you when she handed him a new pencil. Willa was still silent, still hadn't spoken a single word. But her nightly ritual of standing at Reese's door continued, and she had begun to let Agnes brush her hair without shrinking away. But Piper, The 17-year-old who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders since she was 15, was breaking in a way no one noticed. At 2 a.m, Agnes woke to a faint sound from the kitchen. She lay there listening for a moment, hearing running water, the soft clink of dishes touching. She slipped on her robe and stepped out. Piper was standing at the sink, her back to the doorway. She was washing dishes that had already been cleaned after dinner. She washed them again. Then again. Her hands moved mechanically, scrubbing each plate as if her life depended on their spotless shine. Agnes said nothing. She walked into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, sat at the table, and waited. The water kept running. Piper kept washing. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Then her shoulders began to shake. Slightly at first, then harder. "I don't know what to do." Her voice fractured in the stillness of the night. "About what?" Agnes asked gently. Piper stopped moving but didn't turn around, still staring into the sink, the water still flowing. "About everything. All of this." She set the plate down and gripped the edge of the sink as if trying to hold herself upright. "I've taken care of them since I was 15. Mom got sick. I quit school. I worked double shifts at the laundromat. I kept food on the table. I kept us together. I kept us out of the system as long as I could." Her voice caught. "And now someone else is doing that. Someone else is keeping them safe, feeding them, protecting them." She turned then, her eyes red, looking at Agnes with the desperation of a child who had forgotten how to be one. "And I don't know who I am anymore. If I'm not the one keeping them alive, then what am I?" Agnes was silent for a long moment, letting the words settle between them. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but steady. "Come here. Sit down." Piper hesitated for a second, then walked over and sat across from her. She stared at the table, unable to meet Agnes's eyes. Agnes drew in a slow breath. "I once had a daughter, Marta. She got sick when she was 9. Cancer, like your mother." Piper looked up, startled. Agnes had never spoken about herself before. "I cared for her for 3 years, fed her, bathed her, held her when she cried, held her when she couldn't cry anymore." Her voice remained calm, but something deep in her eyes held a pain that had turned to scar tissue without ever truly fading. "She died when she was 12. Silence stretched between them, heavy and sacred. After she was gone, I didn't know who I was either. I had been her mother, her nurse, her everything. And then I was nothing at all." Agnes reached across the table and took Piper's hand. Her palm was rough from years of work, but warm and steady. "It took me years to understand. You're not their mother. You never were. You're a child who took care of other children because no one else would." Piper wanted to protest, to say she had to, that there had been no other choice, but Agnes squeezed her hand gently. "But you're here now. Someone else can carry that weight. And you get to be 17. You get to be their sister. Just their sister. That's enough." That was when Piper broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks without restraint, without any effort to stop them. She cried, for the first time since her mother died. Not only for the loss, though that ache was still there. She cried because she was allowed to set the burden down. Because someone finally saw her for what she truly was. A child who had grown old too fast, who had carried too much, and now didn't know how to stop. Agnes stood, walked around the table, and held her. She didn't speak again. Sometimes silence is enough. Sometimes it is enough simply to have someone there, holding you while you fall apart. The next morning, Piper slept late. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't the first one awake. When she entered the kitchen, breakfast was already on the table. Jace was eating, Bo was drawing. Willa sat in a high chair Agnes had somehow found, looking out the window. Agnes said nothing about the night before. She didn't mention the tears or the story shared in the dark. She simply placed a plate of pancakes in front of Piper and poured her a glass of orange juice. But there was something else on the table, beside Piper's plate. A book, the cover worn, the corners softened, clearly read many times. A bookmark rested at the first page. Piper looked at the book, then at Agnes. "You like to read. I've seen you looking at his library. This one's good." Piper picked up the book, her fingers brushing over the aged leather cover. For the first time in 2 years, she had something that was hers alone. Not food to divide. Not clothes to hand down. Not responsibility to carry. Just a book. Just hers. She opened to the first page and began to read. 4 weeks passed, and life inside the penthouse began to take on the shape of something almost normal. Jace started lessons with the tutor Reese hired, reluctant at first, sitting with his arms crossed, staring at the middle-aged woman with round glasses as if she were an enemy. But then they reached history. And something shifted. He began asking questions, began reading ahead, began arguing about battles and decisions made by men who had been dead for hundreds of years. "Why do you like history?" the tutor asked one day, genuinely curious. Jace shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the page. "Because it already happened. You can't change it. You can't lie about it. It just is." Bo was changing in his own way as well. The 8-year-old started speaking to Agnes. First a single word like more when he wanted another pancake, then 2 words, then sometimes even a short sentence. He still wouldn't speak to strangers, still whispered only to Piper when necessary. But with Agnes, with Reese, and occasionally with Sully, he began to open his mouth. Piper read. She read constantly. She began spending time in Reese's library, a smaller room lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, and each day she carried out a different book. She read on the sofa, read in the kitchen, read before bed. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to disappear into worlds that weren't her own. Willa remained silent. She hadn't spoken a single word since the day their mother died, but she began to show expressions she hadn't before. She frowned when she disliked something, tilted her head when she was curious, and sometimes, very rarely, the corner of her mouth lifted slightly when Bo did something foolish. She wasn't back yet, but perhaps she was on her way. One afternoon, Reese called Jace into his office. The 14-year-old entered with the familiar caution he still carried, though it had softened over time. Reese was seated behind his desk, but he wasn't working. He was waiting. "Come here." Reese stood and led Jace into the living room, to the low coffee table. He knelt and pointed to a small button hidden beneath the edge of the table, nearly invisible, unless you knew where to look. "If something happens when I'm not here, press this. Sully will be here in 4 minutes." Jace studied the button, then looked up at Reese, his eyes narrowing. "You think something's going to happen?" Reese straightened and met his gaze with a seriousness Jace had learned to recognize. "I think it's better to be prepared than sorry. I have enemies, and now they might think you kids are my weakness." Jace was quiet for a moment, considering his next question. "Are we your weakness?" Reese looked at him for a long time, as if searching for the most honest answer. "No. You're the reason I'm more careful than I've ever been." Before Jace could respond, the door opened and Sully stepped in, his expression grim. "Boss, we've got an issue." Reese turned, signaling for Jace to stay while he moved toward Sully. They spoke in low voices, but Jace caught enough words to feel his pulse quicken. "Someone's asking about the Hartley kids, not Drummond, someone else," Sully continued. "Gerald Crane. Owns a textile factory out in the suburbs." Reese's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "Go on." "Crane just filed a petition with the court for custody of Piper. Claims he's the godfather your mother appointed before she died." Reese was silent for a moment. Then he turned toward Jace. "Get Piper." Jace ran and returned with Piper, the 17-year-old entering with a book still in her hand, confusion on her face. Reese looked at her, his tone gentle but firm. "Do you know a man named Gerald Crane?" Piper froze. The book slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull sound. Her face drained of color in an instant, her hands curling into fists so tight her knuckles went white. Jace stood by the doorway, watching his sister's reaction, his own fists tightening. He didn't know who Gerald Crane was, but he recognized fear when he saw it. And Piper was afraid. Reese stepped closer, his voice lowering. "What did he do?" Piper didn't answer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. That was enough. Reese didn't need the words. He turned to Sully. "Find out everything about Gerald Crane. His business, his finances, the people who work for him. Everything." Sully nodded. "And Sully," Reese added as the man turned to leave. "Dig deep. Men like him always have something to hide." Sully nodded again and disappeared through the door. Reese looked back at Piper, still standing there, shaking like a leaf in the wind. He didn't touch her. He understood she didn't need that right now. He simply spoke, his voice steady as steel. "He won't touch you. Any of you. I promise." Piper lifted her eyes to meet his. Fear was still there, but something else flickered beneath it. For the first time, she wanted to believe him. 3 days later, Gerald Crane walked into Reese's office on the 30th floor, as if he owned the place. 55 years old, heavy-set with a swollen belly stretching his white dress shirt. His face flushed the deep red of a man who had spent decades drinking too much, and a smile so wide it revealed a row of yellowed teeth. The kind of man who looked friendly in a way that made you check your wallet after shaking his hand. Beside him stood his lawyer, a thin man with thick framed glasses and a worn leather briefcase clutched against his thigh. Mr. Calder. Crane stepped forward with his arms spread as if greeting an old friend. A pleasure. I'm sure this is just a small misunderstanding. Reese didn't rise, didn't offer his hand, didn't invite them to sit. He remained seated behind his desk, gray eyes cold as winter steel. Sit down, Mr. Crane. Tell me what you want. Crane blinked at the chill in the room, but his smile held. He pulled out a chair and sat, his lawyer lowering himself beside him, the briefcase resting on his lap. Well, it's simple. Piper Hartley. Her mother was a dear friend of mine. Before she passed, God rest her soul, she asked me to look after her children. He spread his hands as if presenting the most obvious truth in the world. I have documents, signatures, witnesses. I'm their godfather, Mr. Calder. Legally. Reese remained expressionless. Is that so? Tell me about your relationship with the Hartley family. Crane leaned back, comfortable as though lounging in his own living room. Oh, we go back years. Mrs. Hartley worked for me, you see, at my factory. I helped them when times were hard. Loaned them money. Quite a bit, actually. He chuckled, the sound slick with false nostalgia. And Piper, such a hard-working girl, started helping out when she was 14. Good kid, quick hands. Reese said nothing. He simply listened, allowing Crane to tighten the rope with his own words. Of course, there is the matter of the debt. Crane sighed as though burdened by sorrow. Her mother owed me a fair sum when she died. I'm not unreasonable, but a debt is a debt. He leaned forward, the smile sharpening. So here's what I propose. Either you return Piper to me so she can work off what her mother owed, fair and square, or you compensate me. For my loss, for my emotional distress. $200,000 seems reasonable. He leaned back again, still smiling. Otherwise, I'll take this to court. I have paperwork, I have witnesses, and frankly, Mr. Calder, I don't believe a judge will look kindly on a single man with a background that's, how shall we say, less than transparent, taking in 4 children. Silence stretched across the room. Reese didn't react. Crane waited, his confidence swelling as he mistook the stillness for hesitation. So, do we have a deal? The silence lingered. Crane shifted slightly in his chair. Mr. Calder. Reese smiled, for the first time since Crane entered the room. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was sharp and cold, and it didn't reach his gray eyes. Thank you, Mr. Crane. Crane blinked, confused. For what? You just told me everything I needed to know. Reese rose slowly and walked around the desk. Child labor, debt bondage, forged guardianship papers. He paused and pointed toward the corner of the room. Crane turned and froze. A small camera, its red light blinking steadily. And you recorded yourself saying it all. Crane's face drained of color in an instant, the red fading to a sickly gray. His lawyer shot to his feet, the briefcase slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor. This meeting is over. Reese inclined his head, his voice soft as wind. Yes, it is. Crane and his lawyer hurried out. The confidence they had carried in evaporated entirely. The door slammed behind them, leaving the office in silence. Sully stepped out from the adjoining room where he had watched the entire meeting on a monitor. Reese turned to him. 48 hours. I want everything. Tax records, employment files, safety violations. Every child who has ever worked in that factory. Sully nodded, committing it to memory, and find former workers, the ones who might want to talk. Reese turned back to the window. The city stretched beneath him in cold indifference. Sully asked, and then we bury him, legally, without leaving a trace. That night, the penthouse lay wrapped in silence. The children had long since fallen asleep. Agnes had retired to her room, and only the faint glow from Reese's study spilled into the hallway. Jace couldn't sleep. As usual, he lay staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to settle. Too much had happened in the past weeks. Too many things he didn't understand. Finally, he slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the others, and stepped into the living room. He meant only to get a glass of water when he heard voices drifting from Reese's study. The door was cracked open, light and words slipping through the narrow space. Jace stopped. He knew he shouldn't listen, but survival had always spoken louder than manners. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. Sully's voice. "Everything's ready. Crane won't know what hit him." Reese's voice, cold and controlled. "Make sure it's clean. No trace leading back to us." A brief pause. Sully asked, "And if he tries to run?" Reese answered, his tone light as air. "He won't get far. Handle it." Jace froze. Handle it. The two words rang in his head like an alarm bell. In the world he grew up in, among dangerous men and dark corners, those words had only one meaning. He stepped back, his heart pounding so loudly, he feared they would hear it through the door. Reese isn't different. The thought struck him like a blow to the stomach. Just a different kind of monster. Using money instead of fists. A penthouse instead of a warehouse. But still a monster. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't live with a killer. Jace hurried back to the bedroom, moving quietly but fast. He pulled the backpack from beneath the bed, the one he'd kept ready since the first day in case they had to run. He shoved in a few clothes, a couple of granola bars he'd saved from breakfast. Then he moved to Piper's bed and shook her shoulder. "Wake up." His whisper was urgent. "We have to go. Now." Piper opened her eyes, groggy and confused. "What?" "Jace. It's 3 a.m. He's not who we think he is." Jace gripped her arm. "I heard him. He's going to kill Crane." Piper sat up, fully awake. "What are you talking about?" "I heard him tell Sully to handle it." Jace's voice trembled. "You know what that means. We can't stay with someone like that." Piper looked at him for a long moment, moonlight from the window casting pale silver across her face, revealing the shadows of years without rest, and eyes far older than 17. Then she asked, her voice strangely calm, "Where will we go, Jace?" Jace blinked, caught off guard. "Anywhere. Back to where?" She cut in softly. "The streets. Another Drummond. Another Crane. At least we know what we're dealing with." Jace shot back, though his certainty had thinned. "Do we?" Piper pushed the blanket aside and turned to face him fully. "I talked to Agnes. I know what he does. I know he's not clean. But Jace, he hasn't hurt us. Not once. He doesn't ask for anything. He feeds us. He lets us sleep. He doesn't lock the doors." She glanced toward the other bed where Willa lay curled like a kitten, tiny fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "And Willa." Her voice softened. "She stands at his door every night. Every single night. She chose him before we did." Piper looked back at her brother, steady and unflinching. "Maybe she sees something we don't." Jace stood there with the backpack slung over his shoulder, looking at Piper, looking at Bo sleeping deeply, the stuffed rabbit pressed to his chest, looking at Willa, small and fragile and silent. "What if you're wrong?" he asked, the words sharp as a blade. "What if he's exactly what I think he is?" Piper met his gaze. "Then we'll face it. Together. Like we always have." She paused. "But I'm not running anymore, Jace. I'm tired of running." Silence filled the room. Jace stood in the doorway, the weight of the backpack heavy on his shoulder. Everything in him screamed to run. Run like he always had. Run before something terrible happened. But he looked at Piper, the sister who had carried them for so long, and for the first time he saw that she didn't want to carry them alone anymore. He looked at Bo and Willa, the siblings he had sworn to protect, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Then he set the backpack down, said nothing, returned to bed, lay back. He didn't leave. But he didn't sleep either. He lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the first light of dawn, and praying that Piper was right. The next morning, Jace sat at the breakfast table with eyes red from lack of sleep, stirring his bowl of cereal without truly eating. He hadn't slept at all after his conversation with Piper, lying awake and staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. The television in the living room was on, Agnes watching the morning news as she usually did while preparing breakfast. Jace wasn't paying much attention, his mind still tangled in thoughts of the night before, of what he had heard, of the decision to stay that he still wasn't sure was right or wrong. Then he heard the name. Breaking news. Local factory owner Gerald Crane arrested on federal charges. Jace set his spoon down and turned sharply toward the screen. There was Crane in handcuffs, being led out of a building by FBI agents, his once flushed face now pale and panicked. The charges included tax evasion, labor law violations, and child exploitation. Authorities stated that the investigation began after documents were delivered to the state attorney general's office. Jace went still. Not violence. Not handle it the way he had feared. Paperwork. The law. The right way. He had been wrong. Completely wrong. The next report stunned him further. Former CPS coordinator Keith Drummond arrested in connection with a child trafficking ring. 9 children in 5 years. Drummond. The man who had tried to take them that day. The man Reese had paid to save them. Now he was in jail, where he belonged. Agnes stepped forward and switched off the television, her expression unreadable. That's enough news. Eat. Breakfast continued in silence, but Jace couldn't swallow another bite. After everyone finished, when Piper took Willa to bathe, and Bo settled into his usual corner with his drawings, Jace stood and walked to Reese's office. He stopped in the doorway, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I almost left last night. Reese looked up from the stack of papers before him. There was no surprise in his face. I know. Sully saw you packing. Jace blinked. You knew. And you didn't stop me. No. Why not? Reese set his pen down and leaned back, studying him with gray eyes that gave nothing away. Because if you wanted to go, I wouldn't hold you. This isn't a prison. He paused. I told you the first night. A warm place. A safe place. That's all. I never said it was a cage. The doors have never been locked, Jace. They never will be. Jace swallowed. Then what is this? Reese met his gaze without hesitation. A choice. Yours. Every day. You stay because you choose to stay. Not because you're forced to. Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. Jace finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. I thought you were going to kill him. Crane. Reese didn't blink. I considered it. Jace waited, unsure what he was waiting for. But killing him would have been easy. Reese continued calmly, making sure he rots in prison for the rest of his life while the whole world knows what he did. That's better. That lasts longer. Jace nodded slowly. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Some things lived beyond words. He turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. Tonight, I'll sleep in the bed. Not on guard. Then he left. That night, for the first time since entering the penthouse, Jace didn't lie on the outer edge of the mattress facing the door. He lay between Bo and near Piper, letting Bo press close with the stuffed rabbit tucked under his chin. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept through the night without dreams. 1 week after Crane was arrested, life in the penthouse had truly settled into rhythm. Jace studied with his tutor every day, no longer sitting with his arms crossed in defiance but actually engaging, even asking for extra books about the American Civil War to read in the evenings. He no longer stayed up at night standing guard, no longer slept on the edge of the bed facing the door. Piper read more and more, and recently she had begun asking Agnes about earning her GED, the high school equivalency diploma for those who hadn't finished school the traditional way. Agnes had found the information and placed a set of prep books on the table beside her without saying a word. Bo had changed the most. The 8-year-old not only spoke more but had begun drawing in color. His pigeons now had blue skies and yellow suns instead of gray pencil lines. Willa was still silent, still hadn't spoken a word, but she had started following Agnes everywhere like a small shadow. She sat on a high stool in the kitchen while Agnes cooked, trailed behind her while she cleaned, and sometimes even lifted her arms to be picked up without making a sound. That morning, Reese put on his coat, preparing to leave. I'll be back before dinner. Sully's staying with you. His eyes moved over the children at the breakfast table, pausing for a second on Jace. If you need anything, you know what to do. Jace nodded, the panic button beneath the coffee table. 4 minutes. Reese left. Sully went down to the office floor below. The penthouse settled into its familiar calm. Agnes worked in the kitchen. Piper read on the sofa. Jace did his schoolwork. Bo drew at the window, and Willa sat beside Agnes watching her knead dough. At 2 p.m, the doorbell rang. Agnes wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. 2 men stood there in wrinkled cheap suits, faces hard as stone. We're here for the Hartley kids. Their godfather sent us. Agnes straightened, filling the doorway with her small but unyielding frame. There is no godfather here. Leave. The first man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ma'am, we have legal paperwork. The second man didn't bother pretending. He shoved the door and stepped inside, pushing Agnes aside like she was nothing more than an obstacle. "You will not enter this home," Agnes said, her voice steady though she had lost her footing. "Move, old woman," the second man growled. Jace heard the noise from his study area and ran out. He saw the strangers in the living room, saw Agnes being shoved toward the wall. "Hey," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and fury. The first man turned toward him with the satisfaction of a predator spotting prey. "There you are. You and your little sisters are coming with us. Quietly. No one gets hurt." Agnes lunged forward, placing herself between Jace and the men. "You will not touch these children." The second man lost patience. He shoved her hard. She stumbled and fell, her head striking the corner of the wall with a sickening sound. A line of red appeared across her forehead. Jace didn't run. He didn't hide. While the two men were still looking at Agnes on the floor, his hand reached beneath the coffee table. He found the small button, pressed it hard. Then he grabbed the baseball bat propped near the door, the one he had asked Reese to buy for practice but had really kept for this moment. He stepped into the hallway leading to the bedrooms where Piper had already taken Bo and Willa to hide. "You want them. You'll have to go through me," the first man sneered. "Kid, don't make this hard." Jace lifted the bat, stance steady. "You have 4 minutes before some very dangerous men walk through that door. If I were you, I'd start running." The two men glanced at each other, not believing a 14-year-old would dare threaten them. The second one moved toward Jace, fists clenched. "You're joking." Ding! The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Sully stepped out, 3 large men behind him, faces blank, hands rough with the familiarity of violence. Not even 4 minutes had passed. The intruders barely had time to react. In seconds they were on the floor, arms twisted behind their backs, faces pressed into the carpet. Sully moved to Agnes, gently helping her sit up. Blood still ran from the cut on her forehead, but she brushed him off. "The children. Check the children." Jace ran to the bedroom and found Piper in the closet, holding Bo and Willa tightly. Bo's face was white, trembling but not crying. Willa was curled into Piper's chest, eyes squeezed shut, her small body shaking uncontrollably. Piper looked up when she saw Jace, tears streaking her face but her voice strangely steady. "It's okay now. It's okay. It's over." Sully called Reese the moment it happened. Reese was in the middle of an important meeting when his phone vibrated, and when he saw Sully's name on the screen, along with the emergency code they had established, he stood and walked out without a word to the others in the room. He broke every traffic law on the way back. Red lights didn't exist. Speed limits didn't exist. There was only the road ahead and the penthouse at the end of it. When the elevator doors opened, the first thing he saw was Agnes sitting on the sofa with a strip of white bandage across her forehead, calmly pouring tea as if this were an ordinary afternoon. "Agnes," he said her name, tension sharp in his voice. "I'm fine. Just a scratch. Tea," she replied without looking up, pouring hot water into the pot, as if she hadn't just been shoved by a man twice her size and struck her head against a wall. Reese scanned the room quickly, assessing. Sully was on the phone in the corner, likely arranging the disposal of the 2 intruders. Piper stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she tried to pour water for her siblings. Bo sat in his usual corner, but instead of drawing, he held his stuffed rabbit and stared into nothing. And Jace. Jace stood by the window, looking out at the city, the baseball bat still in his hand. He hadn't let it go. His fingers were wrapped tight around the handle as if releasing it would make everything collapse. Reese stepped beside him and stood there for a moment in silence, both of them looking at the city below. "You didn't run," he said quietly. Jace didn't turn. "You said this was a choice. I chose." A pause. Then Reese spoke again, his voice different now, softer, more sincere than Jace had ever heard it. "You did well." Jace went still. He turned, staring at Reese as if he had misheard. "What?" "You did well," Reese repeated, meeting his eyes. "You protected them. You pressed the button. You bought time. You did well." Jace couldn't speak. No one had ever said that to him before. Not move aside. Not you're useless. Not let the adults handle it. But you did well. His eyes burned slightly, but he didn't cry. He only nodded, tightened his grip on the bat for one last second, then turned back toward the window. Reese understood. He didn't press further. He left Jace with his space and went to check on the others. Willa was still in the closet in the bedroom. She refused to come out, Piper knelt in front of the closet door, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "Willa, come out. It's safe now. It's over." No response. Bo tried next, his 8-year-old voice shaking, but determined. "Willa, I'm here. Come out." Willa curled tighter into the corner of the closet, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes squeezed shut. Agnes brought a mug of warm milk and set it beside the door. "Warm milk, sweetheart. The kind with honey you like." Willa didn't look, didn't move. It was as if she had retreated back into the cocoon she had only just begun to leave in recent weeks. Rhys stepped forward and motioned for the others to give him space. He sat down on the floor beside the closet, his back against the wall. He didn't open the door, didn't try to pull her out. He simply placed his hand gently against the wooden door and said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Come out when you're ready. No pressure, no force. Just waiting." 5 minutes passed, 10. The others gradually returned to small tasks, giving Rhys and Willa room. Piper made tea for Agnes. Jace finally set the baseball bat down. Bo picked up his pencil and began to draw again, his hand still slightly unsteady. Rhys remained seated, his hand resting on the closet door, silent. Then the door opened a crack, just a narrow line. A tiny hand reached out from the darkness, fingers small and searching in the air. Rhys lifted his hand and let it rest there, waiting. The small fingers found his thumb, wrapped around it, held tight. Willa slowly crawled out of the closet like a frightened little animal testing whether the world outside was safe. Then she climbed into Rhys's lap and curled into him, her face pressed against his chest, still silent, but she had come out. Rhys sat there with her in his arms, quiet. One hand rested gently on her back, moving in slow, steady circles. Jace watched from the window, Piper watched from the kitchen, holding a cup of tea long gone cold. Bo watched from his corner, pencil hovering above the page. Agnes watched them all, one hand pressed to her chest, as if steadying her own heart. No one spoke. There are moments that rise beyond language. 2 weeks after the break-in, they stood in the hallway of family court, waiting for the hearing that would decide the future of all 5 of them. Monica Vale, Rhys's attorney, a 45-year-old woman with close-cropped silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, met them in the corridor for final instructions. "We have a strong case," she said, her voice confident but not careless. "The incident 2 weeks ago actually helps. It shows you can protect them." She looked at Rhys, then at the 4 children standing beside him. "But the judge will ask questions. Be honest. Be calm." Rhys nodded, his expression as unreadable as ever. The 4 children stood in a line next to him, dressed more neatly than they ever had before. Jace in a white button-down shirt fastened to the collar, clearly uncomfortable in the formal clothing, tugging at the fabric as if it were choking him. Piper in a navy dress Agnes had chosen, her hair brushed into a low bun, looking older than 17, and yet somehow younger than she usually did. Bo holding his stuffed rabbit, freshly mended by Agnes, with a bright red bow that made it look almost distinguished. And Willa, the smallest, in a white dress trimmed with lace, gripping Piper's hand as if letting go might make her disappear. They entered the courtroom. It was not large, the ceiling low, fluorescent light casting a cold wash over everything. The judge was a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and black-framed glasses. She watched them with an unreadable gaze as they took their seats. Monica began presenting the case. Rhys's legitimate work history, the businesses he owned on record, the taxes he had paid in full, letters from neighbors in the building attesting to his character, reports from school and doctors showing the children were well cared for, healthy, and beginning to recover. Most notably, the police report from the break-in, detailing the security measures Rhys had installed. The way the 14-year-old had used the panic button at the right moment, the way Rhys's team had responded within 4 minutes and subdued the intruders without causing serious harm. The 2 men had testified that they were hired by Crane to retrieve the children, unaware that Crane had already been arrested and was awaiting trial on multiple serious charges. The judge listened to it all, nodding occasionally, taking notes. Then she looked up, her gaze settling on Rhys. "Mr. Calder, what makes you qualified to raise 4 children?" Rhys stood, tall in his black suit, but without the arrogance or display of power he carried in his other world. "Nothing, Your Honor." The courtroom went still. Monica frowned slightly. This was not the answer she had prepared him to give. "I'm not a father," Rhys continued, his voice calm but sincere. I never planned to be one. I don't know how to braid a little girl's hair. I don't know how to help with homework. I don't know how to do any of that." He paused. "But I'm learning. Every day, I'm learning. And I'm not going anywhere. If the court allows it, I'll be here, for as long as they need me." The judge studied him for a long moment, then turned to the children. "I want to hear from you. What do you want?" Monica began to speak, perhaps to ask permission to answer on their behalf, but Jace was already on his feet. No one told him to stand. No one signaled. He rose on his own, back straight, eyes fixed on the judge. "We want to stay. With him." Piper stood next, her hand resting lightly on Willa's shoulder, so the little girl would know she was still there. "He's the first person who hasn't wanted something from us. Just us." Bo stood as well, clutching his rabbit to his chest, and for the first time in his life, the 8-year-old spoke before a stranger, his voice small but clear. "Safe. We feel safe." Willa did not speak. She still couldn't, but she let go of Piper's hand and walked in tiny steps down the aisle between the benches to where Reese stood. She looked up at him, then lifted her small hand and wrapped it around his finger, the same way she had on the frozen sidewalk that day. Silence filled the courtroom. The judge watched that for a long time. A 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a word, walking across the room to choose the man she wanted as her father. The gavel struck. Full legal custody granted to Reese Calder. Not temporary. Permanent. Piper didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and let out a long breath as if she had been holding it for months. Jace nodded once, as if checking off an item from a long list of responsibilities he had carried. Bo smiled. The first real smile since stepping into the penthouse. The smile of an 8-year-old finally allowed to be 8. Willa still held Reese's hand. She didn't let go. Monica turned to Reese as they exited the courtroom, a rare smile touching her serious face. "Congratulations. You're officially the father of 4 children." Reese looked down at Willa holding his hand, then at Bo, smiling, Piper exhaling, Jace nodding. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer, warmer than before. "I guess I am." On the drive back, the black Escalade moved smoothly through familiar streets in silence. But it wasn't the tense silence of the first time they had sat in this vehicle. 4 children huddled together, afraid and unsure where they were going. This was the silence of people who didn't need words anymore to understand one another. Jace leaned against the door, watching the city slide past beyond the glass. But he wasn't looking for an escape route now. Piper sat in the middle with Willa in her lap, one hand resting lightly on Bo's shoulder beside her. Bo held his stuffed rabbit with the new red bow, touching it now and then as if to make sure it was still there. Reese sat up front beside Sully at the wheel, glancing at the rearview mirror now and then to see the 4 children, his children now, sitting quietly behind him. The elevator carried them up to the 47th floor and opened with the familiar ding. Jace stepped out first, as always, but he stopped at the threshold of the penthouse, looking inside. Piper came up beside him, brows drawn. "What is it?" "Nothing," Jace said, his voice strange, soft in a way he rarely allowed. "It just feels different coming back this time." "Different how?" Piper asked. Jace didn't answer. He simply walked in, and for the first time since he came here, he didn't check the exits, didn't measure the room, didn't scan for something he could use as a weapon. He just walked in, like coming home. Agnes was in the kitchen, the bandage gone from her forehead, only a small bruise fading as it healed. She looked at them with her usual stern face. "You're late. The food's gone cold. Sit down." As if nothing special had happened. As if today were just an ordinary day, and not the day the court officially granted Reese custody. But on the dining table, beside plates of steaming food, there was a chocolate cake, candles set on top, not yet lit, and written in uneven, crooked white icing, but clear, were the words, "Welcome home." Bo recognized the familiar handwriting, his eyes lighting up. "Agnes, did you write this?" Agnes turned away, setting more plates on the table. "My handwriting is terrible. Eat." Dinner started, but no one really stayed seated. Reese stepped into the kitchen and stood beside Agnes as she finished a salad. "I want to help." Agnes gave him a skeptical look. "You don't know how to cook. Then teach me." Agnes watched him for a long moment, weighing how serious he was. Then she put a knife and a potato in his hands. "Peel it. Don't cut yourself. I'm not a nurse." Bo appeared at the kitchen doorway, his stuffed rabbit carefully placed on a chair. "Can I help too?" Agnes handed the boy a wooden spoon and pointed to the pot of soup simmering on the stove. Stir. Don't stop. Jace walked past the doorway, saw the scene, and stopped. Do you need another person? Agnes pointed to the sink full of dishes. Wash dishes. Piper appeared behind Jace. I can clear the table. Agnes nodded, and just like that, the whole family worked together in the kitchen. Soft conversation, the clink of pans, the sound of running water, and Beau's little giggle when Reese peeled the potato so badly Agnes had to sigh. Willa didn't go into the kitchen. She sat in her usual spot by the balcony glass, on the small chair Agnes had sat there in the first week. Outside, the familiar pigeon perched on the railing, cooing in the sunset. Willa watched it. Piper turned, about to call her sister to dinner. Then she stopped. Willa was looking at the bird. Really looking. Not the empty stare that used to pass through everything, but looking with focus, with presence, her head tilted as the pigeon hopped along the railing, left to right. Piper took hold of Reese's sleeve and tugged gently. He turned and saw her pointing toward Willa. He followed her gaze, and the two of them watched in silence. Willa lifted her hand, her tiny palm pressed against the cold glass. Her mouth opened. No sound. Not yet, but there was shape. Rounded. Almost a word. Piper held her breath, her hand tightening around Reese's arm. Agnes stopped, ladle hovering over the soup, her eyes fixed on the 3-year-old by the window. Beau stopped stirring. Jace turned from the sink. The whole kitchen went silent, every eye drawn to Willa. No one moved. No one breathed. The kitchen froze in that moment as if time itself had paused, waiting for something about to happen. Willa still sat by the glass door, her tiny hand pressed against the cold surface, her eyes fixed on the pigeon perched on the railing outside. The bird tilted its head and looked back at her through the pane, as if waiting, as if inviting her. Willa's lips moved, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Piper saw it, Reese saw it, the whole room saw it. B. The first sound slipped out, so small it almost didn't exist, like breath given shape, like a soul trying to find its way home from a distant place it had been hiding for 8 months. Piper lifted her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. B. The second time louder, clearer. Willa pressed her hand harder against the glass, as if trying to reach the bird, to reach the world outside, to reach the life she had locked herself away from the day her mother died. The pigeon hopped closer along the railing, its head cocked with quiet curiosity. Bird. The word entered the room the way light enters when someone pulls back the curtains after a long dark night. Not with an explosion, not with a shout. It simply arrived, quiet and real and unstoppable. 8 months of silence. 8 months without a single word. 8 months a 3-year-old had locked her voice away with the memory of the day her mother left this world. And now it broke open with one simple word about a bird. Bird. Willa said it again as if testing whether the word was real, as if relearning how to speak after too long in silence. She turned from the window and looked into the room, and for the first time in 8 months, her eyes were present, no longer staring through everything into nothing, no longer lost in some distant place no one could reach. She was here, truly here, returned from wherever she had been hiding. Her gaze found Reese. She stood and walked toward him on unsteady little legs, crossing the living room step by step. One step, then another, until she stood before him and looked up with wide, clear eyes. She reached out and wrapped her small fingers around his, just as she had on the frozen sidewalk that first day. She looked up at him and opened her mouth. Bird. And her face did something it hadn't done since the day her mother died. She smiled. Reese dropped to his knees. Not because his legs failed him, but because something in his chest did. Something broke open. Something he had sealed shut for 24 years since the day they put Sadie into that car, and he stood there at 13 screaming and helpless. He had built walls around that wound, buried it beneath layers of ruthlessness and control and power, believed that if he never opened it again it would stop hurting. But now, as he looked at this 3-year-old holding his hand and smiling and speaking her first word after 8 months of silence, the wall collapsed. And what poured out wasn't pain. It was what comes after pain, the thing you find when you have carried sorrow long enough and someone tells you that you may finally set it down. Willa lifted her hand and touched his cheek, touching the dampness there that he hadn't realized was present. Bird, she said again, as if teaching him the word, as if sharing with him the most miraculous discovery she had made. Jace stood at the kitchen doorway, the ladle still in his hand, long forgotten. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. He didn't need to hide anymore. Piper cried silently, one hand covering her mouth to hold back the sob, the other gripping the doorframe as if she might fall. Beau whispered, his voice trembling with wonder. She said it. Willa said it. Agnes turned off the stove with slow, deliberate movement, as if in a dream, then stood there with one hand pressed against her chest, as though steadying her heart. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, the first true smile since the day her own daughter died many years ago. Sully stood in the corner, no one certain when he had entered. He turned his face toward the window, but his shoulders trembled. A man built like a refrigerator, who had seen too many terrible things in his life, was trying to hide the fact that he was crying because a 3-year-old had said the word bird. No one spoke. No one needed to. Some moments don't require language. They only require witnesses, and all of them were there. Witnessing a little girl find her voice again, on the 47th floor of a penthouse, in a family none of them had ever expected to have. Bird. Willa said once more, and she laughed. And that laughter, the first in 8 months, filled the room the way sunlight fills a house that has been closed too long. 1 year later, the penthouse on the 47th floor no longer looked like the home of a man who lived alone. Beau's drawings covered the refrigerator doors, bright paintings of pigeons and sky and family, no longer gray pencil sketches like in those first days. On the balcony, a small bird coop now housed 2 pigeons that Beau had named Pepper and Salt, and they cooed every morning like living alarm clocks. Piper's books had claimed every shelf in the library. She had earned her GED and was applying to college, dreaming of becoming a literature teacher. Jace's basketball rested by the front door, and stacks of history books crowded his desk. Willa's toys were everywhere, under the sofa, on the tables, in the kitchen, and no one complained, because no one wanted this home to be perfectly pristine anymore. It looked lived in, because it was. Jace no longer stayed up at night keeping watch. He was learning to drive with Sully every weekend, and Sully said he was the worst student he had ever taught, but still showed up with patience each week. Jace still read history at night, but now it was because he wanted to, not because he couldn't sleep. Piper told Reese one evening that his library needed more poetry, and the following week an entire new shelf of poetry appeared. She didn't say thank you. She simply smiled and chose a book to read. Beau spoke in full sentences to the people he chose. Reese was on that list. Agnes was on that list. He volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend because, as he explained, animals don't judge. They either like you or they don't. And Willa, now 4 years old, had 47 words in her vocabulary, which Agnes counted carefully. Bird was still her favorite. Papa was second. One morning, Agnes stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at the whole family gathered around the table. Piper was arguing with Jace about a novel, her voice animated and her eyes bright. Beau was patiently feeding Willa and wiping sauce from his little sister's cheek with the tenderness of a protective older brother. Reese was attempting to flip pancakes in the skillet. Still not very good after a year, but trying every single day. Agnes's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them quickly with the corner of her apron before anyone noticed. But Piper noticed. "Agnes, are you all right?" Agnes was silent for a moment, looking around the noisy, messy kitchen filled with laughter and debate. My daughter Marta would have been 32 this year. Silence settled over the kitchen. I think she would have liked this. All of you. The noise. The mess. She looked around and smiled through her tears. This family. No one spoke. Piper stood and went to her, wrapping her arms around her. Then Beau ran over and hugged her waist. Then Willa toddled forward and hugged her leg, looking up and saying Agnes. Jace didn't hug her, but he nodded to her from across the table, a nod heavy with meaning, and for him that was enough. The following Sunday morning, Reese made breakfast. Nothing burned. Piper had taught him after many embarrassing failures, after pancakes black as coal and eggs tough as rubber. Willa sat in her high chair with her legs swinging, watching him cook with wide eyes. "Papa," Reese stopped, set the spatula down, turned to her. "Yes, sweetheart, pancake, almost ready." Piper stood in the kitchen doorway watching them. When Reese passed her to grab plates, she placed her hand briefly against his back, leaving it there for a moment before pulling away. A small gesture. A thank you without words. That night, after the children were asleep, Reese and Piper stood on the balcony looking at the city lights below. "She called you Papa again today," Piper said. "I heard. How does it feel?" Reese was quiet for a moment, gazing at the distant lights. like something I don't deserve. Piper turned to him, her gaze steady. You do. You kept us. You fed us. You fought for us. You stayed up all night with a boy who wanted to hate you. You let a 3-year-old hold your finger on a frozen sidewalk, and you didn't pull away. That wasn't a transaction, Reese. That was a choice. Every day. Silence lingered between them. I never found Sadie, Reese said softly. I know. 24 years. Nothing. But you found us. Piper took his hand. Not found. You stopped on a street corner on a cold day when everyone else drove past. That wasn't searching. That was choosing. And you have chosen us every day since. Inside the penthouse, Willa woke up. She walked into the living room and saw Reese and Piper standing on the balcony through the glass. She didn't go outside. She simply stood there at the window and watched them. Then she began to sing. The song her mother had taught her. Her voice small and clear and brave. Reese heard it. He closed his eyes, listening to a little girl who had once been silent for 8 months sing the song her mother taught her in a home a stranger had built 47 floors above a world that had tried to break her, and failed. Piper leaned her head against Reese's shoulder. They stood there listening to Willa sing. The city shimmered below. And it was enough. More than enough. This story reminds us that family is not always the people who share our blood. Sometimes family is the people who choose to stand beside us through our darkest days. That healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from finding those who are willing to walk forward with us. That one act of kindness, one moment of stopping when the whole world keeps driving, can change an entire life. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Share this video with those you love, because sometimes the right story at the right time can brighten a dark day. How did this story make you feel? Did it make you think of someone in your own life? Was there a moment that brought tears to your eyes? Leave a comment below. We read every single one and truly want to hear what is in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.